A group of abuse survivors is calling for an investigation into private religious schools in Missouri. The same group also wants Missouri state lawmakers to end the statute of limitations for filing a sexual abuse civil lawsuit. Missouri Capitol Bureau Chief Joe McLean talked to the group calling for action.
We're living in an epidemic of child sexual abuse, where 1 in 13 children will be sexually assaulted before their 18th birthday. Many think that might be a conservative number.
The Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, also known as SNAP, staged a demonstration Monday, signing and then hand-delivering a letter to Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey. It asks the AG to launch an investigation and motivate other prosecutors to scrutinize private religious boarding schools after a string of recent sexual abuse allegations.
These kinds of places are ripe for abuse and cover-up, and they tend to attract unfortunately, predatory individuals who know they have a captive audience, so to speak, of victims.
The letter also asks Bailey to issue a warning to parents that religious schools have far less state oversight as private institutions.
Many who were abused by clergy say that they felt the fear, describe the fear that they felt when the most powerful person in their lives and in their family's life is doing this to them.
Survivors say that creates an environment where the school and its staff are incentivized to keep abuse quiet, weaponizing the religious beliefs of victims and their families.
The clergy have seemingly absolute power over these children and their families, and the fear is tremendous when they have to deal with what these priests and other clergy are doing.
Members also testified in favor of legislation that would end the statute of limitation for sexual abuse civil cases. Bailey's office didn't respond to our request in time for this broadcast. Bailey was appointed AG last year and is running to be elected to that office. In Jefferson City, Joe McLean, KY3 News.